So I have the great pleasure of taking us home. We have a lot of young people in our industry, in the programmatic industry, and obviously a lot of young people in Xaxis, and we constantly coach those young people because in many cases, this may be their first job or their first significant job. And we have a term we like to use, which is a career-limiting move. And that's a move that has limited upside. And so I'm about to make a career-limiting move and interview my boss. And I want you to know that I do recognize that, but I'm doing it for the sake of science and for the sake of education. So I'm truly honored to welcome our next guest, Irwin Gotlieb. He is the global chairman of GroupM. Irwin sits at the top of the largest buyer of media in the world, a concept he quite literally invented. No wonder many of the industry press have dubbed him the king of media.
I'm just a short Jewish guy.
I mean, this is the part where this is before I ask you the hard questions. No one knows the media business like Irwin, and no one has been as influential in shaping it. He has earned numerous accolades, including being the first advertising executive to be inducted into the Broadcast Hall of Fame, 45 years in the advertising business. Before I go on, I will say that Irwin literally invented the concept of unbundling media from creative services and was the founder not only of Mindshare, but also of GroupM. So with that, Irwin, welcome.
And for the absence of doubt, what is now SMG?
A brand many of us, worked hard.
I don't quite remember who they are, but they're still out there.
Those letters mean nothing to me. So, Irwin, you are the architect of what I would call the most significant change in the media business, certainly on the agency side. When I was a kid growing up, my father ran advertising agencies, and the media department was always the group of people that went last. Sometimes they fell off the back of the presentation. It was sort of like, well, maybe we'll get to the media guys, maybe we won't. You had a different conception, and obviously that was driven by changes in the marketplace, which is media is actually as strategic, and now I would argue more strategic, than creative services. And the first big step to realizing that was unbundling media from creative, and then creating the media agency, later creating the media agency holding company. There are many people, including me, that think programmatic media buying, or more broadly, data and technology, represent the next big change in the media agency business. So the question is, do you agree with that? What parallels do you see between what's happening now and what happened when media agencies were created, and what's GroupM doing to lead that change?
So the dynamics are quite different, right? I mean, the reason that I played the role that I did has less to do perhaps with me than the circumstances that I found myself in. I happened to work not for a typical ad agency, but for a company called Benton & Bowles, that at the time had the country's two most media-savvy clients, Procter & Gamble and General Foods. And media wasn't a backroom function. It was a highly respected function, right? And, I mean, we did programming, we produced movies, we did television shows, we did 5 soap operas, 5 hours of production a day. We were the largest production entity in the country at the time. We did all non-scale union negotiations for talent, and on and on and on, right? But it sort of gets to a key point, and it sort of converges into the question that you asked, because I have always had a very, very strong view that if you start with integration as the objective, you're never going to achieve the appropriate level of specialization. If you start with a specialized capability and then work really hard to integrate it, at least you have something of fundamental value that you can integrate. Which sort of gets me to programmatic, right? So programmatic, in my view, is not the new development du jour. It's actually kind of old. I've said this publicly a number of times. When we began to get Nielsen respondent level data in the mid-90s, 96 to be exact, we began to deploy systemic optimization to do channel selection, day part selection. We actually felt that day parts and channels weren't granular enough, so we went to program subsets and all that. Those were entirely systemic solutions. Why? Because there was no way you could get humans to do that kind of work, right? You had to do it too quickly, it was too detailed, and it was mind-numbing work. You just couldn't get it done. In my view, that was a programmatic step, okay? Programmatic in today's context is a little different. But there's no question, with granularity of data, with the detail level that we have to deal with, everything is going to move programmatically, right? We have to develop the expertise. We have to develop the specialization. After we do that, we have to find a way to keep it integrated so that strategically we can have a holistic view of the entire chain. I mean, if one were to articulate what our role is 3 to 5 years from today, it is that we really do two things. We aggregate demand so that we can trade more effectively, on the one hand, and that encompasses fully understanding the supply and demand chain, understand how to manipulate it, have the tools to do all those things. And secondly, we have to have the tools and the data to allocate budgets and to do the attribution analytics so that we know how to predict the cost per outcome. And in order to do that, you have to have a level of integration.
So on that point,
by the way, we're out of time now.
So you mentioned that two objectives. One is to aggregate demand. The second is to have and be able to operate the tools to provide analytics and insight. The press loves to talk about this concept of advertisers in-housing programmatic. And that's because if you look at charts like the Lumascape, you see an explosion of companies, all of which are venture-backed, that need to justify their existence in a very complicated ad tech ecosystem. Many of those companies add a lot of value and have high utility, but because they're venture-backed and in some cases they've gone public, they need to find revenue, and they're pushing past the agency to the advertiser. But I also think advertisers are getting much smarter about media, and they're getting smarter about data, technology, and are starting to feel like maybe that aggregation of demand isn't as important in a programmatic world. So is this trend towards advertisers in-housing their programmatic real? And what would you say to advertisers that are sort of thinking about, well, I'll hire a DSP or I'll get a DMP and I'll do this myself?
So we could sit here and debate the issue around aggregation of demand continuing to be important. I would argue that it's always going to be important, right? Nobody is small by choice, right? That's not a reference to my height. I mean, nobody runs a small business because they want to, right? It's small because it's not good enough to be big. Aggregation of demand is going to remain critical, but there's an even more important factor, and that is you have to aggregate technology capabilities and you have to aggregate data, because data at scale is far more valuable than data that's not at scale, right? I mean, we talk about being able to see the entire web several times a day around the world. That comes from scale. It doesn't come from disaggregation. So there is that aspect. There is a second aspect to this, and that is, you know, we have a client, they're called Netflix. These people understand data. They've got relevant data, probably more of it than anyone else. They understand technology. It's in their DNA. When a company makes toothpaste, I would argue that perhaps technology and data isn't part of their DNA, right? Package design is, but it's a different DNA. And so, can they do it? There's a second thing. We're not only an aggregator of demand, we manage a portfolio of demand that provides enormous diversity, so that when you go to a publisher, when you create a public market for yourself, a private marketplace for yourself, you can negotiate terms that are favorable because you are helping the other party manage their inventory goals. No individual client can do that, not so much because they lack the scale, but specifically because they lack the diversity. And that's a critical component.
So in terms of tools, I mean, we're sitting here in AppNexus's office, and we, GroupM, WPP, Xaxis, did a significant deal with AppNexus last year, where we sort of declared them one of our major technology partners in the programmatic space. But of course, GroupM and Xaxis in particular has a lot of proprietary technology, and I would argue that clearly WPP, GroupM, Xaxis, we're not an ad tech company, but there is value in developing technology in terms of the competitive advantage we can bring to clients. So where do we decide to build versus partner within GroupM?
So I think there's a really straightforward answer to that as well. I used to say if you could buy the software shrink-wrapped, you should, right? Today, if you can buy the software and download it, God bless, do that. We are not in the business of software development. We're in the business of media investment management. If it is a capability that is a benchmark capability, we don't need to do it ourselves. If it's a capability that benefits from an ecosystem approach, we should encourage it, we should act as catalyst, but we don't need to do it ourselves. If it is going to give us proprietary advantage, if it is going to give us a knowledge asymmetry that works to the benefit of our clients, then we absolutely need to do it, right? We have this philosophy that I can't take credit for this articulation. Someone else did it, Phil Cowdell, in fact. But we don't build black box solutions. We build glass box solutions. And it is the unique combination of technology and the way we teach people to use that technology so that the combination of human brain power and systemic horsepower come up with optimum solutions. And that, I think, is pretty unique out there.
So picking up on something you said yesterday, you were at the ANA yesterday, and there's been a lot of controversy.
Was it only yesterday?
and this was covered in Ad Age today, but along those same lines, in terms of you describing how a media agency is evolving, one of the things you said was perhaps agent or agency is not even the right word to describe what we do anymore. And I think you've articulated sort of what you mean in terms of our development of data, technology, aggregation of scale, not just in inventory, but in data. But in terms of the people within an agency, you've been in the business for 45 years.
I just, this month, began my 46th year.
46 years in the business. That's deserves a round of applause.
I started my first job several years before I was born.
And I believe we've discussed this, but my first job out of college was at DMB&B. So you were running that company, and I was an associate account manager. I don't think our paths ever crossed, but I knew you. I don't think you knew me. In any case, how have...
If you'd been smart enough to get into the media department, our paths would have crossed.
That's right. Good point. Um, so, how has the talent evolved?
I'm delighted that they did, however.
And how is it continuing to evolve? And what does the talent within a media agency look like 5 years from now? How is that different than what it looks like now?
I promise you it's going to be really different. I mean, that's the one given. I think all of us, there's something wrong with this microphone. The volume is fluctuating quite a bit, right? Okay. So I think there are several givens here. Most of us who entered advertising over the course of the last 50 years have really focused the bulk of our careers on the top of the funnel. It is only in the last few years, not really the advent of digital, but the evolution of digital, that we began to look not just at the top of the funnel, but at the middle and the bottom of the funnel. We live in a world today where you can identify the characteristics of and begin to define specific target audiences of people who are not only aware and have unaided awareness, but who are beginning to enter the consideration set. And you can begin to target them and you can begin to influence them. And that changes things very dramatically. There's a second component to this, and trust me, it would take a 2-hour presentation to do the topic justice, but in the late 90s, it was even before I got to WPP that this happened, but the team that I worked with is all at WPP today. We wrote a presentation that talked about, it hypothesized on the notion that media, data, and technology would converge. You know, of course, today you look at it, it's very much in the past tense. No one would argue that concept. 10, 11 years ago, we wrote a presentation that said, there is a fourth vector that is entering that equation. And that fourth vector that will converge with media, data, and technology is distribution. All you have to do is look at what's happened to a category like disposable diapers to fully understand that, you know, you really don't need to go to the store to pick up a tube of toothpaste. You don't need to go to the store to pick up a 6-pack of Coke. You know what it looks like. It's not a tomato. It's not a piece of salmon where you may want to look at it, touch it, squeeze it, whatever, right? And by the way, as someone who loves to cook, and I don't get to do it very often, but as someone who loves to cook, I'll go to the store, I'll go to market, I won't decide what I'm going to cook until I'm in market. The part where I go pick up the salmon and the tomato, I kind of enjoy. How much emotional fulfillment do you think I get from finding the 2-gallon jug of Tide? Right? I would really, really like to forego that chore, right? As would everybody else in this room. So you know that ultimately that's what's going to happen, right? Wonderful Tom Friedman line. Today, if it can be done, it will be done. The only question is, will you do it or will it be done to you? So there's no question that media becomes virtual shelf space. As media becomes virtual shelf space, we move from delivering cost per thousands or delivering impressions to delivering very, very specific outcomes. And we talked earlier about having the data and the technology to support both the management of aggregated scale, the management of that supply and demand equation, the trading operations, the allocation of media channels, and that in turn is driven by attribution analytics that cross all those channels that allow you to predict, develop the probabilistic approaches that you need to sell clients specific outcomes, right? There is a perversity to this that I think many clients will have difficulty comprehending, and that is that each incremental sale is going to cost you more than the last one. Anybody who deals in a procurement mode knows that the more you buy, the cheaper, right? Well, when you're selling outcomes, it doesn't work that way. There's a diminishing returns curve that is associated with that. So if you use that as context, and we are a business that works the entire funnel, we move from selling cost per thousands to selling outcomes. We've got a really different breed of people in the organization with a very different fundamental approach to the task. And by the way, agency would really be the wrong term to use in that context. I'm not suggesting we're going to stop calling ourselves a media agency, but it's an artifact of history. And by the way, just so everybody is clear, that artifact of history itself is misunderstood. And it's not because I'm old enough to actually remember this, I'm not. But media agencies ad agencies were originally called agencies, not because they were the buyer's agent, but because they were the seller's agent. The publisher paid the agency a commission to sell the media, right? So we were never, even the artifact of history suggests a different position for us.
So what's interesting about that is, clearly the ecosystem is changing. Publishers are advertisers, consumer products companies are running media businesses and advertising business, and it seems like it's all, the traditional value chain is breaking down, or maybe better said, it's just merging together. And if I understand you correctly, you're saying that it's no longer an agent, but it's more, in the future, guaranteeing something, whether that's a rate or an outcome, or perhaps in the future, we would go to a client and say, we'll guarantee a certain market share. We'll guarantee you 2 incremental points of market share. But to your point...
Or 100,000 sales at $1 a piece, and the next 10,000 sales at $1.20 a piece, right?
Right.
With increasing cost.
But there's risk in that, and there's investments that require. So how is that changing how GroupM, the media agencies, and I put Xaxis, included in that, but how is that changing how we do business with advertisers?
So I took the position yesterday at the ANA that we shouldn't refer to ourselves as an agent as soon as a client asks us to take a risk position. Because an agent doesn't take risk. An agent acts on behalf of a client, but the client assumes all the risk. By the way, go to your financial manager and tell them that you want them to have a fiduciary obligation to you, but if they don't perform well, it comes out of their pocket, right? Good luck with that. We have inadvertently, as a business, allowed ourselves to fall into that trap. And it doesn't work that way. We have to be honest. And by the way, I got a lot of favorable comments about the remarks I made yesterday. I got no negatives on this point because there's no one who can argue with that principle. As soon as you take principal risk in a transaction, you are no longer an agent by definition. Your ability to be neutral is no longer there, right? You are focused on a single point of delivery, and that isn't neutrality anymore. And I really think that when we get to a point where we are selling clients outcomes, we can be more intellectually honest in our approach, and our interests and the client's interests will be far better aligned. I made this remark yesterday also that the procurement organizations that we deal with are very often entirely misaligned with their own marketing organizations. Now, it doesn't always happen. We have some really, really strong procurement relationships, but those almost always are those situations where our client's procurement operation and marketing operation have really clean alignment, right? When we get put in a position where we're in the crossfire, not so much. But nobody really took issue with the point that when you take principal risk, you cease to be an agent, you cease to be able to function with real neutrality. And I really believe that the only way things are going to get sorted and people will operate with a level of trust and satisfaction is when we get to a stage where the interests of procurement, marketing, the client corporation, and ourselves are totally aligned and we're all pulling in one direction.
Switching gears, we saw Jordan present about the new fronts, and then Christina talked about what is connected TV, what is digital TV, what is programmatic TV. TV is evolving quite a bit. Still a very strong market, but as Christina showed, there is an evolution of how people are watching TV. And now we're in the new front season, and of course we're in the upfront season. How is TV changing? Will we ever realize programmatically served ads in the linear TV feed, and what do we need to do to get there?
So, backing up to some of the comments I made earlier, big chunks of television decisioning became programmatic 18, 19 years ago. Television is evolving. If you think you've seen changes in the last couple of years, you better buckle up, because the rate of change is only going to escalate, right? You've got smart TVs, you've got addressability, you've got dynamic ad insertion. You will be hearing from us about a very, very important second screen application that allows over-the-top interactivity directly coupled and synchronized to television. So you can do coupon drops, you can do RFIs, you can do just about anything you want. Scheduled test drives. You can even pull entire transactions because there is a TV wallet that is attached to that app, right? Pretty powerful stuff. Television gets redefined. Your ability to target, to segment, and work the entire funnel changes. The good news in all this, and Christina covered it, is that television viewing is declining as measured by an out-of-date and nearly obsolete Nielsen yardstick, right? They are not aggregating viewing across devices because they can't. WPP, as you know, has done quite a bit in that space. We did a 20% acquisition of Rentrack last year. More recently, we did a 20% stake in ComScore. We put the ComScore folks and the Rentrack folks in a room together, and I can't talk about what happened, but you will hear about it in the course of the next couple of months. And you can just imagine, right? One party does all the devices other than televisions, and the other party does televisions and VOD. If you could get them working together, you could solve an awful lot of problems. What we're telling a lot of our clients now, by the way, as it relates to the specific season is, the yardstick's broken. Television consumption, when it's added back up again, those ratings are where they've always been, as Christina indicated, right? It's a flawed yardstick. Your CPMs may rise, but they're not really rising. There are some specific opportunities that come from those situations. Manipulation opportunities, arbitrage opportunities, et cetera, but I think they're going to be fully exploited. But television as a medium is going to be a very, very powerful marketing tool for many years to come. I also think that television won't be thought of as the simple standalone medium it is today, because it will intertwine itself with digital in ways that haven't been imagined. And the example that I gave you with a synchronized second screen that remains synchronized to what you're watching on the big screen, that gives you a level of interactivity with what's on that screen. By the way, you know, the applications on the content side and the engagement side are enormous, because if you're watching a service show, a cooking segment, the recipe shows up on your iPad, right? A news show, a more detailed analysis of the news story goes to your iPad. If it's a reality show, you can vote, you can participate, you can do all sorts of stuff. Just think of the implications for polling in an election. Think of the implications for running advertising in an election. Media is going to transform itself. And I think in many ways it's going to become far less siloed than it is. And it's going to take a lot of work on all of our parts just to keep up with it.
So final question, and I know you have to run and we want to get people to their cocktails. Anybody that's ever been to CES knows, the Consumer Electronics Show every January in Las Vegas, knows that Irwin's tour is the most famous, most well-attended tour of CES. So having nothing to do with media, or perhaps it does have something to do with media, but what technology, what one device or one piece of software will fundamentally change our lives more than any other that you've seen at this past CES?
I don't think it's this past CES. I think we saw it a couple of years ago. Its first manifestation was Google Glass. I think Google Glass was a really shitty execution of the concept. They are coming out with Google Glass 2. I don't think it'll be much better. But I think we are moving to a world where we are going to have, you know, today we talk about the screen and the second screen, and we are going to have a third screen. And I just think of that third screen as an ambient screen, right? Now, what's an ambient screen? Well, it could be Google Glass. It sits in front of your eye all the time. A year and a half ago, for 3 weeks, I walked around like an absolute moron with Google Glass on my head, determined to live through it. And I hated the experience because it was constantly telling me the 3 movies in the neighborhood that I had no intention of seeing, 3 restaurants I wouldn't think of being seen in, right? News clips from the New York Times that were so abbreviated that they weren't even sensible. And I couldn't wait for the 3 weeks to be over, right? And then I took them off, and I realized I missed them. Now, I didn't miss them enough to put them back on again, don't misunderstand me. But I did miss having the time up there all the time. I mean, doing this is just a little bit clunky when you haven't done it in 3 weeks. I broke the law. I used it for navigation. Having it there ambiently was way better than looking at the display. By the way, my car now has a heads-up display, so I don't have to look away from the road. Before CES 2014, a company called Avigant put out a device called Glyph. It's a prototype. It sort of looked like Google Glass. It was a titanium band that sort of went this way, very thin, and it had 2 little micro projectors. They were the size roughly of a large tablet that you swallow. You don't want to swallow one of these. They're micro projectors. They beam straight to your retina. Okay? When you talk to the scientists, They not only talk about those pill-sized things getting smaller, but they talk about implanting them 5-7 years from now under your eyelid. So I don't know whether Avigant, with their Glyph product, is going to be the implantable device. But you can safely assume that down the road we will have an ambient screen. We will be connected to a computer all the time. We will be able to give commands by thinking about them. We will be able to see outputs without looking anywhere specific. It'll just be there. So think in terms of 2-screen paradigm moving to 3-screen paradigm. And what that says to me is we can market to you for every minute of every waking hour.
And with that, I will say, Irwin, thank you very much.